for coming. You live in London or thereabouts,
yes.
So it's a journey over, but you've got a good story to tell. We're looking forward to it. Mike lived in what was then Rhodesia, southern Rhodesia, I think, Mike, was it? Southern Rhodesia?
Yeah, it was a Republic of Rhodesia
yeah.
when I got there in about 1972. But it was southern Rhodesia before that.
Was it was involved. Mike was CEO of the documentation, I suppose, publications division of the Commercial Farmers Union, is it? Commercial Farmers Union in Rhodesia, and for many years I think ran that and published their newspaper or their magazine.
A weekly magazine.
Yeah, emphasising once again, Michael, the importance of having a journal or having a magazine.
Yeah. Oh yes.
Right, and so very difficult times in Zimbabwe at the time, and the political situation there, I think, resulted, Mike, in you leaving Zimbabwe. The matter of dispossession, we know about dispossession in Ireland. We have gone through different periods of dispossession, and without getting into the politics of it, because there was repossession as well in Ireland, which meant that somebody else was in a sense lost their land in the late 1800s with the land reforms here. So, but whatever political aspect there is to it, it is always a human trauma to be forced off land or to have to leave land that you brought to fertility and cultivation. And I think that more or less or somewhat represents your story, Mike. So it's a great pleasure indeed to welcome you here tonight. If I may just make a few announcements before we continue with your talk. This is the last talk, as I said, of the season. We start in September with Eugene Broderick, I think, who is going to talk about John Hearn, the shaper of our 1937 Constitution. James Doherty, local Waterford historian, will talk about the Mars, Thomas Francis Marr, the Gaultier connections especially, the man who brought the flag, in a sense, to Ireland. So we kick off the season with those two events. On Monday the 25th of April, here in Dunmore, the Society will unveil, or the pupils of the schools in Gaultier, of the 6 primary schools in Gaultier, will unveil, the students themselves will unveil a commemorative stone to 2016. That will happen at 1 o'clock down in the village, across from the Azuro restaurant, at 1 o'clock on the 25th, on Monday the 25th. We will resume our summer walks, our evening walks, probably starting in June or July. We haven't decided yet. And the usual Harvest Festival will take place. Michael is one of the committee members, Bob is here as well. That will be held sometime during summer. The end of July, Michael. So, on behalf of our society, thanks very much, Mike, for coming, and it's over to you.
Okay, thank you. I am going to refer to notes because I'm getting on a bit, and I find it very difficult to speak for more than 10 minutes without referring to notes. So I'm sure you won't mind. Excuse me for that. I'm going to try a little bit of Gaelic out. Jihad Div. Greetings. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am honoured to have been chosen by the Barony of Gaultier Historical Society as the 3rd and final guest speaker for the spring series of talks for 2016. To borrow words from a title originated by one of your own well-known Waterford playwrights, the late Jim Cheasty, a stranger came. I sincerely hope I will leave you all as a familiar friend. Amongst the gathering here this evening is my son Troy, my cousin Martin, and my other cousin Michael, Martin's younger brother. They're here not so much to support me, but rather to spend quality time in the pub with the likes of yourselves. And Martin, we're very happy to be here and on this make it a social occasion and this wonderful atmosphere here. My topic tonight is simply sharing some memories of my time in Zimbabwe and its predecessor, Rhodesia. As I am addressing an historical society, I have tried to be accurate when chronicling events, whilst at the same time being entertaining in the delivery. I'll consider my stated objective achieved if over the next 50 to 60 minutes most of you resist the temptation to head for the bar. So hopefully you'll all be seated here when I finish. I'm starting with my exit from Zimbabwe. And I'm travelling back in time to my arrival in Rhodesia. I'm going back to front. So fasten your seatbelts as we start the journey in reverse order. It was at the turn of the millennium when Zimbabwe began its long and painful slide into perdition. The citizenry were aghast and transfixed as the economic malaise gathered momentum and the value of the Zimbabwe dollar plummeted into the abyss with the speed of a falling lead weight. In the blink of an eye, retrenchments, joblessness and abject poverty had become the order of the day. A combination of two mortal blows created Zimbabwe's economic implosion. The first mortal blow was the onset of the extensive and often violent farm invasions. The follow-up knockout punch was unscheduled, unbudgeted payouts made by the Exchequer to placate angry and frustrated former nationalist guerrillas, referred to as war veterans. And then the Zimbabwe currency started to seriously depreciate against the hard currencies of both Europe and America. Instead of being a noble cause, let me tell you, Zimbabwe's much touted land reform program, as packaged to the world at large, was in fact a fiasco. What should have been a well-executed exercise to resettle the majority of rural Zimbabweans as productive farmers was in fact a scurrilous fraud. Those that it was designed to benefit were betrayed. Rather than economically empowering the communal peasant farmers, the land reform became a vehicle to bestow political patronage. In an unseemly scramble to snatch the biggest and the best agricultural enterprises, ruling party sycophants used every opportunity to sing and shout praises at the Zimbabwe president. Contrary to what the government media and information ministry reported, the farm invasions were not a spontaneous land grab by rural Zimbabweans. The perpetrators squatting on the farms were unscrupulous thugs and political opportunists, acting with covert support from the president himself. What triggered the forced and violent appropriation of white-owned farms? Well, it is a matter of fact that the War of Liberation, otherwise known as the Chimurenga, was all about land. At independence, 1980, white farmers owned 70% of the most arable land in the country. When President Mugabe assumed power as Prime Minister, food production was at a premium and Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of the region. Tobacco exports alone accounted for 31% of the country's foreign exchange earnings. The new government did not intend throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and for most of the 1980s there were cordial relations between the 6,000 plus white members of the Commercial Farmers Union and the fledgling administration. There's an old African saying, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled. There's another wise old proverb, pride comes before a fall. During the latter part of 1999, Zimbabwe's white farmers made a catastrophic error of judgment by taking on Zimbabwe's president, Robert Mugabe, in the political arena. In a display of arrogance and perceived invincibility, one prominent white farmer invited the broadcaster, CNN, onto his property to film himself and his fellow white farmers funding the leader of Zimbabwe's burgeoning opposition party, the Movement for Democratic Change. The CNN film clip showed the NDC leader Morgan Tsvangirai receiving fat checks from his beneficiaries whilst grinning into the camera like a Cheshire cat. And shortly afterwards, 13th of February, 2000 to be exact, the red flag was waved at an already enraged presidential bull. What happened was there was to be a crucial constitutional referendum that the Zimbabwe president and his ruling ZANU-PF party were expected to win, and expecting to win too. The referendum was to introduce a new constitution that would keep Mugabe in power and legitimise an orderly appropriation of white-owned commercial farms by government. The referendum was lost in no small part, and it's the first time Mugabe had lost any vote, so he was very angry, in no small part to white commercial farmers busing thousands of their labour to the polling booths countrywide with instructions to vote a big no. Mugabe was outraged. The old crocodile, as they call him, was ready to rumble. Instead of crops, white farmers would soon be reaping the whirlwind of illegal, unbridled and often violent farm invasions. The punitive side effects of the unseemly land grab on the many companies servicing and supplying the agricultural industry were immense. The company that I headed, that published the Weekly Farmer, became one of the first of many to suffer serious collateral damage, and the jobs and livelihoods of me and my colleagues were prematurely demolished. After 23 years with the CFU, I had a long-standing annuity consisting of dual contributions paid in by myself and the union. I was looking forward to a good pension and retirement on a houseboat on Lake Kariba. I'm reminded of the wise words of Robbie Burns, "The best laid schemes of bison men gang on la gley." A frightening aspect of Zimbabwe's tottering economy was the shortage of essential drugs and the existing charges of medical attention and prescriptions. Healthcare insurance was beyond the pockets of most families. Average life expectancy was on a downward trend. AIDS fatalities in particular were on the increase. Sufferers were unable to either afford or to find the medication. Even those fortunate enough to source the medication through non-governmental organisations were losers, because the lack of a proper diet totally negated the medication's usefulness. Month on month, inflation was creeping up to shocking levels of around 1,200%, reminding terrified Zimbabweans that even worse aftershocks were yet to come. Due to the hyperinflation, Zimbabwe at that time boasted more millionaires per head of population than any in the first world. 250 trillion Zimbabwe dollars were worth just $1 US. To illustrate, one local woman took her wheelbarrow to the bank in Harare, the capital city, in order to carry the amount of bills she would need to purchase almost anything. Bag of tomatoes, loaded the wheelbarrow with currency. Two young men seized the wheelbarrow, emptying the cash at her feet and running off with the wheelbarrow. They didn't want the cash, it was useless. So there you go, that gives you some idea. And I remember watching Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on Zimbabwe TV. By the time they reached question 15 at the end of the programme, the prize money was worth less than it was at question 1 when they started. I recall telling a punter that had just won the jackpot in the Zimbabwe lottery, if you hurry, you'll have enough money to buy next week's ticket. The perennial long queues for the staple food, which is meal, and for petrol and diesel, had disappeared because neither were available. The only queues were at passport offices up and down the country, as every day thousands of Zimbabweans were desperately trying to get out and seek sanctuary elsewhere. Most of the horses had bolted before the stable door had closed. Before the United Kingdom and South Africa implemented their closed-door policies, over 3 million souls had already made the great escape and slipped through the net. Interesting parallels today. They'd left behind a trail of worthless money, almost zero employment, opportunities were nil, scarce and unaffordable commodities and services, a shattered economy in free fall, and a citizenry in despair. There was a sense of betrayal not only directed at Zimbabwe's leaders, but also at the old colonial power Britain, the European Union, and of course the African Union. My ability to ride out the storm started to erode in June 2005, and that was my personal time when I was almost giving up. I had been self-employed since the closure of the Farmer magazine in early 2002, and income from my informal freelance work was shrinking and had shrunk considerably. And I had my son at school. At my advanced age, and with the formal unemployment figure running at over 90%, I found myself at the end of a cul-de-sac. To keep my son at school, and meet cost of living expenses, I sold my car and then sold my house. The rationale behind such crucial and momentous decisions was to increase capital, and in so doing increase income from additional interest. However, after selling my home in September 2005, I moved with my son into a 2-bed apartment not far from Harare town centre. I signed a 6-month lease at a monthly rent of 30 million Zimbabwe dollars. The end came suddenly and brutally, January 2006, a month before the expiration of my lessee's contract. It was in the form of a letter in the post from the estate agent giving notice the owner was selling the property. Inquiries confirmed that if alternative accommodation was available, the rent would be pitched at approximately twice the amount we had been paying, around 60 million Zimbabwe dollars per month. I did not ask about the deposit. As carefully and as many times as I did my sums, I found it was mission impossible and just hopeless to make income meet expenditure. It was at last time up and time to leave. The only positive aspect in a black cloud of despair was that my son had successfully completed his school curriculum and his school year. So a few hours before heading for the airport, clothes were packed into 2 suitcases, 1 each, and shortly before the issue of a new 1 trillion Zimbabwe dollar banknote, I and my son were on our way in search of a new life, out of Zimbabwe, out of Africa. On the evening of departure, Harare Airport seemed strangely quiet and subdued, almost in a state of mourning, reflecting perhaps the general feeling pervading the nation. The doom and gloom was exacerbated when there was an announcement advising our Air Zimbabwe evening flight to London would leave very late. The delay, we were told, was due to the authorities having to search the highways and byways of Harare for enough aviation fuel to fly to London. It was a struggle when the time came to lift our cases onto the baggage scales. They were most definitely overweight. Not surprisingly, as my son and I were endeavouring to take as much clothing as we could, possibly pack into the 2 suitcases. Even though we carried some millions of dollars, pocket money, to pay for excess baggage, it was not enough. The asking price was tens of millions for those extra kilos. There was no option except to dig into our suitcases and shed some of our much needed clothes and footwear. It was a dreadful setback. So I may just have a sip. Yes, it was a dreadful setback. After clearing immigration and customs, we wandered through to the duty-free shop. We were almost alone, except for 1 or 2 fellow travellers grabbing bottles of liquor. We gazed in awe at products and brand names we had not seen displayed in Zimbabwe shops for years. With my last remaining few $100,000 in dollars, I sensibly decided to buy a few bars of chocolate for sustenance on arrival in UK. We would be served dinner and breakfast on the flight, but I had no idea when we might eat after disembarking. My son treated himself to a Lucky Charm bracelet to remind him of home, which he might still have, but I do remember him buying that. We trekked onwards to the airport's inner sanctum, where the departure lounge. I wondered how many other fellow passengers were also saying a final goodbye to the motherland. Suddenly there was a loud crackling noise, and an excited voice announced over the loudspeakers that juice to feed the plane's engines had finally been located. Soon we would be on our way. The national airline, I must say this, epitomises the friendliness and the hospitality of the average Zimbabwean. It was an excellent airline. On boarding the aircraft, myself and my son discovered we'd received a complimentary upgrade to business class, and we left in style. Arrival at our destination would prove to be a dramatic contrast. Despite all of the country's woes, I am not ashamed to say that as the big jet lifted off Zimbabwean soil and started its climb over the outskirts of Harare, there were tears. Face tap. My son's tears had come much earlier, just before leaving the public area of the airport. Unlike me, he had been born in Zimbabwe. He'd never left before. Never left his native Africa. It's very emotional. Please excuse me. We reached UK's Gatwick Airport from Harare on the morning of March 18. It was cold with thick grey cloud cover overhead. A chilly wind blew in through the airport terminal entrances and exits. The staff at the information desk in the departures area had seen it all before. We were another statistic, 2 more victims of African misrule. There was no time to indulge in self-pity. We now had to get alive and rediscover a future. For my young son, it all seemed an amazing adventure. To this day, I salute his courage, tenacity and optimism, and most of all his invaluable support. Allow me to whisk you back through time to January 1971, when I arrived at Salisbury Airport in a country called Rhodesia. That same year, 1971, the Conservative Foreign Secretary, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, had struck a deal with the Rhodesian Prime Minister, Ian Douglas Smith, that would have legalised the Unilateral Declaration of Independence of 1965 and it would have also endorsed the 1970 Declaration of Rhodesia as a republic if the deal had gone through for a new Rhodesian constitution. It is likely that majority rule would never have occurred during the lifetime of the Rhodesian Prime Minister I.D. Smith. Ironic. However, when the Pearce Commission supervised a yes or no referendum, the response, which is interesting, parallel again, in or out coming up here,